thought I was dreaming then, thought I struck one chord of music like the sound of a great amen, like the sound of a great
The organ being the king of instruments, as Mozart so rightly calls it, it is an original gamut machine. That is to say, I think it does the triple pianissimos to the triple fortissimos better than anything else, any other instrument around. Also, this instrument here particularly, and many of those that I play in England, are blessed with a wealth of color. I always say to audiences in the evenings when I start at 8 o'clock, I always say, well, television has only a few colors, but I have about 750,000 possibilities on my machine, so I think you're better off coming to hear a simple village organist like me play.
The organ has such a rich and varied repertoire stretching back to the 16th, 17th centuries, and there's some very interesting music being written at the present time for it. So it's first and foremost the music written for it that interests me.
If you do find yourself seated one day at the organ, you could hardly wish for a more versatile instrument. It can pipe sweetly in an 18th century concerto by Handel, or it can blast away in a modern concerto by someone like Poulenc. As an accompanist, it has infinite variety. It can melt into the violin, it's especially suited to the trumpet, it can support the vulnerable beauty of a boy treble. Or an heroic tenor in an oratorio. It can accompany a choir with the greatest delicacy. Or with inspirational power. It can underpin a piece of orchestral writing almost unnoticed, or it can hold forth and dominate an entire symphony orchestra. Most of us hear the organ only in church, where we've come to celebrate a marriage or commiserate at a funeral. Some sing to its accompaniment once or twice a week if they are regular churchgoers. Frequently, the end result sounds like this. Small wonder that if this is how we're introduced to the organ, that few of us listen to one by choice. It's an instrument planted firmly in a place of worship, and the idea of voluntarily going to listen to an organ recital is not an especially popular one. As an amateur practitioner myself, the first thing most people notice about an organist is his absence. Yet over the last few years, organ recitals have begun to make a comeback in the church and the concert hall, so much so that there's a prospect of them becoming as popular as they were a century ago. Organists and public alike have discovered that there's more to the organ than academic fugues and pedantic choral preludes.
Before the invention of, the gramophone record or anything like that, the organ was actually the means whereby people could get to know the works of Wagner and Verdi and this, that and the other in their local town halls. The organist would play these wonderful transcriptions of them, some not so wonderful, some absolutely brilliant. And it had a function of delivering music to the masses. 100 years ago, the organ of Sydney Town Hall, not the Opera House, the Town Hall, was opened by an Englishman, W.T. Best. He was a great man for transcriptions. He made hundreds of transcriptions himself, and he played them wonderfully well. And when he went over to Sydney to do this opening of this wonderful new instrument there, which has the 64-foot pipe and all that sort of thing, wonder of the world, still is. His first recital was only about half full, curiously, and he gave 17 recitals, and after that, after the first one, they were all absolutely packed. There were queues all the way down the roads. People could not get in enough. His fame had just gone out from that first recital only, simply because he was bringing music to these people in an attractive sort of way.
There are very few people who could do that today.
I think there are one or two people. I think things are slightly changing. The organ is associated with the church. It goes with the church somehow. And I think it is also now coming out more into the concert hall. People feel a need to get away from church music on the organ. They want to hear what other music has been written. And actually, I suppose when one thinks about it, the majority of organ music is not actually church music.
The organ is the oldest keyboard instrument. The idea of putting a series of whistles into a box and then blowing air into them from a pair of bellows has been around for a long time, since the 3rd century BC, in fact. Like so many other things, it took an Egyptian to invent it, and it took another 1,000 years for Western civilization to reinvent.
When I float the organ for our Mr. Morgan, who plays at our church every Sunday so grand, the wind in the bellows makes music like cellos and fiddles and trumpets, it's just like a band. At weddings I pumps, while t'other chap thumps, and the choir sings an hymn, if they knows it. The organ's a treat, but without me it's beat, 'cause I am the fella what blows it.
Actually, nothing much has changed in principle since Egyptian days. The Greeks had a hydraulicon, or water organ, so called because water was used to keep the air in the bellows at a constant pressure, and the Romans called it a hydraulis. It was used to provide incidental music at public events by Nero, amongst others, and was so loud that it could reportedly be heard 60 miles away. You might just be able to hear this in Wolverhampton. Thomas Trotter at the organ of Birmingham Town Hall, playing the overture to Die Meistersinger. In front of him are a bewildering array of buttons and knobs and pedals. How does it all work? Well, the basic principle is straightforward. Each stop on either side of the organist controls a rank of pipes, representing a different tone colour or instrumental timbre, and numbering up to 66 pipes in each rank, sometimes even more. Pipes are made from wood or metal, depending on the sound quality desired. The smallest are no bigger than a pencil. The largest could contain 6 people standing on each other's shoulders. One flick of a stop prepares a whole rank of pipes ready to sound when the keyboard is touched. There are buttons beneath each keyboard which automatically couple certain ranks with others to give an infinite number of tonal variations. But the keyboards aren't called keyboards, they're called manuals, and Thomas Trotter has got 5 of them to play on.
Well, starting on the bottom, this is called the choir manual, and this we use quite a lot for accompanimental purposes, and it has some quite delicate tinkly sounds, such as this one. The main manual, the next manual up, is called the great organ, and this has your typical organ sound. typical sound one associates with the organ.
That's the diapason.
That's the diapason, and with its octave higher, it actually makes the sound brighter. This particular keyboard has some of the most powerful stops on it. Here's an example played on the full grades. Then the next keyboard above the grades is called the swell, and it's called the swell because all of the pipes are enclosed in a box, and the front of this box has shutters which can be operated by a foot pedal, and so that the sound can be made louder and softer. And if I just demonstrate with just a chord, here it is with the box shut, and I'll gradually open it and then close it. That's why it's called a swell. The next manual up is the solo division, so called because it has some imitative stops. For example, the clarinet. And also it has a tuba mirabilis, which is one of the oldest stops on the organ. Here's a blast of that. And then the top manual, the fifth manual, is called the bombard, which has some extremely powerful and loud trumpet stops. The lowest pipes of the organ are always to be found on the pedal department. On this organ, the lowest pipe is actually at the front of the case, and it's 32 foot long. There's also a 32 foot reed, which sounds like this. I'll play you from middle C downwards. And that's the lowest note of the pedal. And apart from playing bass notes, it also sometimes is required to play tunes, as in this particular piece by my predecessor, Sir George Thornton Ball.
I think that's quite incredible. You're using your toe heel on both feet and just playing it like a hand would.
That's right. You need very strong ankles and very supple ankles so that you can actually move very fast from note to note. During the course of that particular variation, the feet are required to play chords. Basically, you play one note with the toe, and then the other note with the heel of the same foot. And then when you move from one to the other, you just hope for the best, because it's actually quite easy to press other notes, because my feet aren't that big, but for some people, they'd have a real problem playing that with one foot, because they tend to play the notes in the middle as well.
Yes.
Later on in that piece, the feet are required to do glissandi.
The world's loudest and largest musical instrument is an organ. And though a huge instrument, the Birmingham organ compared to it is a relatively modest affair of roughly 90 speaking stops and 4,000 pipes. The biggest is only partly functional at present, located in the auditorium at Atlantic City, New Jersey. America, of course. It has 1,477 speaking stops and 33,112 pipes. The equivalent volume, of 25 brass bands. The largest fully functional organ is in the Wanamaker Store, Philadelphia, built in 1911. It's only got 30,067 pipes and 6 manuals. The biggest church organ in Britain is the one in the Anglican Cathedral in Liverpool, with a mere 9,704 pipes. Perhaps because of the associations with pagan Rome, it wasn't until about the 8th century that the church relented and started using the organ in places of worship.
It hasn't always been a church instrument. The idea of a small band of instrumentalists playing was very prevalent for a long time, especially in the early part of the 19th century. But I do think that, for some extraordinary reason, I think the acoustics of a church, which tend to be reverberant, respond better, generally speaking, to wind instruments of some sort, and therefore the organ, rather than perhaps string playing and too much, say, loud brass playing. I know that brass playing goes very well in some very big cathedrals, simply because of the reverberation is wonderful when the brass take the cord off at the end. But generally speaking, I think a box of whistles goes well in buildings which are slightly reverberant, let's put it that way, and not crystal clear and dry. And the other thing I would just say about that is that they also, I think, blend very well with voices in general, provided, you take care, whereas is not always the case with other groups of instruments.
Although statistics will probably prove it otherwise, a high proportion of great organists seem to have been blind, right from Italian Francesco Landini in the 14th century through to John Stanley and Handel, who became blind, to William Wolstenholme, Alfred Hollins, Louis Vienne, Jean Langley and Helmut Walcher in this century. And another thing, organists especially seem to be a long-lived breed, despite drafty and heater-free organ lofts. The doyen of British organists, Sir George Thalben Ball, died in 1987 at the age of 89, having been organist and choir master of the Temple Church for over 60 years. The great Vidor of Toccata fame was organist at Saint-Sulpice in Paris for more than 60 years and was still playing when he died at the age of 93. Bach used to walk great distances to Hamburg to hear Johann Reinken play, and he died in 1722 at the age of 99. Perhaps then it's not surprising to learn that the world's oldest active musician is an organist. Mrs. Violet Loder, who's 102 years old and still plays regularly for the Church of Our Lady of Mercy and St. Joseph in Lymington, Hampshire. She played for the services last Sunday, as she's done since 1924. Though she's outlived the organ on which she's played these many years. It broke down irreparably last Christmas after 50 years' usage, and at present she's making do with an undignified electric organ. Horace Bate is a mere babe of 93 by comparison and was organist at St. James Muswell Hill in North London for only 53 years. He's also the father of international recitalist Jennifer Bate. I eavesdropped on a masterclass he was giving her on Elgar's organ sonata.
Now, here, you don't hear these semiquavers in a vast building if the left-handed pedal are hanging onto those crotchets. So I make those into quavers. And I make that chord into a semiquaver. Otherwise, you don't get the brilliance of that little curve which arrives at the climax of the phrase. The climax of the phrase it doesn't appear if you hold all this underneath it. It wants freedom.
Can I just play that then?
Sorry. This chord must be very staccato, otherwise you don't get the repetition on an accented beat. Merely sounds as though you've tied it over. Get that off at once. Now you heard the accent then.
I asked Jennifer if there was a difference between the sound of continental and English organs.
If you think of the German language and the French language, one is guttural, the other's nasal, and the English is a sort of blend of many invasions many, many years ago. And I think our diapason is a fine, broad sound. The principle in Germany is a much more aggressive sound. It's narrower and has a brilliance within it. But the montre in France is actually quite a soft sound. 2 or 3 of those you'd want out at a time, whereas one of ours would do. Again, the reeds are totally different as you go from country to country.
To imitate a traditional Old English organ, how would you do it?
Well, we've got one just down the road here that's just been restored at Kenwood House. And there's no instrument in the country that I have heard which has been built in this century which sounds anything like that one. Not at all. It's brought far more out of the music for me, listening to these instruments than playing it on St James Muswell Hill. And it's so beautiful. But on a modern instrument it could sound really quite dull and doesn't have the same breadth, does it? It doesn't breathe the same way even.
Yes. In Kenwood House, built in the 1790s with just 10 stops. Quite a difference to the sounds made by the mobile Allen computer organ, which Carlo Curley plays, and which he demonstrated to me in St John's, Hammersmith, where it's stored at the moment.
The reason I have this organ is it's actually a touring instrument. There's no less than 35 speaker enclosures, over 2,000 watts of audio power, and in those enclosures you will find a total of about 140, 150 speakers, ranging in size from about 20 inches down to the very tiniest tweeter. And I actually have digital reverberation on the organ in case the building is highly carpeted, for example. And of course, carpet is the bane of my existence, if you know what I mean. I love smooth, reflective surfaces. But this instrument is exquisite in that way of being a totally eclectic, mobile instrument. I wish that I was fortunate to be James Galway and to be able to move a flute and a piccolo and a penny whistle around and go around and play with the great orchestras of the world. Unfortunately, I have to take the sound of a 10,000 pipe concert organ under my arm, and unfortunately it has to be moved in a 20-foot lorry, and it cost a considerable amount of money to get it there. In fact, in many respects, it cost about the same thing to have the organ there as the artist. There's actually even what I think is a very, very nice sound indeed, which is an English horn, which is copied from a big pipe organ in Philadelphia. Beautiful sound, that.
When you say copied from another organ, what does that mean?
Well, digitally sampled. That is sort of where the world of organ building in many respects is going, because of course pipe organs, bless their hearts, are enormously expensive to buy today. Space is sometimes a problem. Finance certainly always is a bit of a problem. Basically, what Alan has done here is this is a touring organ, which is at my disposal, which I tour with when there is no proper pipe organ installed in the venue. What you see here is an instrument that is worth about 50,000 pounds sterling installed in any church or concert hall in this country. It's about 100 plus independent ranks. There's nothing copied. Every knob is completely independent, which means it has enormous integrity, really, particularly for playing contrapuntal music, for example, Bach, Buxtehude, or Handel, you see.
In other words, if you're playing a fugue with three-part writing, you want to have the clearest individual voices possible.
Sure, absolutely. Let me just give you a very brief example of that, because if I just take a little Baroque sound, which is very fine on this organ, I think you'll be able to hear the barking, the chiff, and the wind sound in the pipe, because they've actually gone in and copied very fine examples of pipe organs all around the world, and it's all amalgamated into this touring organ, which is really great fun. It's a little bit of a Bach fugue from the middle of the G minor fugue I'll play for you. Here we go. Just a sort of a fun old sound there. Then we have even little sounds like this this 1 foot stop, which is very, very high. I mean, almost a dog couldn't be summoned by that, if you see what I mean. Then there's wonderful orchestral sounds in the organ, like orchestral imitative sounds like a little celesta. That's a remarkable sound, that. They've actually sampled for me a set of handbells, because when I do some Dakar Noels or Christmas programs in particular, I love the sound of handbells. Listen how absolutely authentic this is.
Now, you've demonstrated the Baroque sound and the English church sound. How about the French organ sound?
Yes, oh,
that's very different, isn't it?
Well, it is. It's based certainly on a very bright reed quality, which we do have on several divisions of the organ. Just to give you some idea, you know, of course, the... wonderful ripping, sort of with wonderful fundamental and bright harmonics. I'll just give you a full organ quality, which incorporates the French sound certainly in it. This is a bit of a big old noise, this, though, I tell you. You've heard this tune before. Now, if that isn't the second coming in Panavision, nothing is.
There are three pieces of organ music which almost everyone knows, which you can all recognise and perhaps even name. Mendelssohn's Wedding March, which you've just heard, the Bridal March from Lohengrin, and Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Ironic, then, isn't it, that none of these best-loved pieces of the organist's repertoire were originally written for the organ. The Bridal March comes from an opera, the Mendelssohn comes from the incidental music for a play, and the Bach, well, A, it's now pretty well established that it wasn't written by Bach, B, that he probably never even transcribed it for organ, C, was probably a violin piece originally, and D, almost certainly written in another key. But is there an organist in the country who hasn't been asked for one of them at some time or other to be played at a wedding service? Not that every bride and groom plump for them, though. wedding of the Duke and Duchess of York in 1986. The organist and master of the choristers at Westminster Abbey at the time was Simon Preston.
We had a meeting with the bride and groom, if one may call them that, the Duke and Duchess of York, really quite early on in the situation. But I think that ground had already been slightly gone over beforehand by other people, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, had seen them first.
But could you say to them, for instance, Royal Highness, I think such and such a piece actually would be quite inappropriate on this occasion, as you actually can't walk down the aisle to Dyer Straits or whatever they want.
Well, Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess, she had a very good notion of what she wanted, and I think Andrew was sort of rather happy to leave it to her, which was quite good. He had other concerns, and she had the concern for the music, and her choices were very good. She had copious choices, as a matter of fact. I remember one of them was the Grand March from Aida, and I thought we were a little bit short on elephants and camels and things in the Westminster Abbey, but she took that in very good part, and I thought her choice of Laudate Dominum of Mozart was an inspired choice. It was very good indeed.
But could you influence them in any way, as organists?
Yes, I tried. Yes, I did. I think I did influence. I think they were very happy with a lot of the things that I chose as a result of her views of what she and her husband-to-be wanted. They had a broad notion of what they wanted, and I was able to put on the details onto the canvas, I think.
Do you find that generally organists do tell a couple these days what they want for their weddings?
I think it's usually the other way around. You usually start off, and not in the case of the royal wedding, they were the ideal bride and bridegroom, really, but other people usually come armed with so many things they really must have. And your problem then is to say, well, it is slightly difficult. We've only got a 2-manual organ with only 3 stops, and one of those isn't working above middle C or something like that. And I'm afraid the choir is away on holiday, and it'll be old Mrs. So-and-so singing by herself or something. So you have to try and cut their coat according to your cloth.
Two manuals? Some couples are lucky if they have one.
The preacher in the village church one Sunday morning heard, our organist is ill today, will someone play instead? An anxious look crept o'er the face of every person there, as eagerly they watched to see who'd fill the vacant chair. A man then staggered down the aisle, whose clothes were old and torn. How strange a drunkard seemed to me in church on Sunday morn. But when he touched the organ keys without a single word, the melody that followed was the sweetest ever heard. Was one I'll never forget as long as I may live, and just to see it all again, all earthly wealth I'd give. The congregation all amazed, the preacher old and grey, the organ and the organist who volunteered.
Some village churches have choirs and organists of a remarkably high standard. Not all of them, though, are lucky enough to have a competent volunteer organist, as this archive recording of a village wedding proves. We don't know who the happy couple were, but they were married in 1951, and I just hope they weren't music lovers. It begins with a sound that is as redolent of England as the sound of church bells across the meadow. It is the sound of a congregation waiting for the bride to arrive, with the organ droning in the background. And now, here she comes, for better or worse. Well, she came into that, but she went out to this. Now that's what I call under-organed. Which is not a description you could apply to this, an arrangement of another piece of Mendelssohn, War March of the Priests, made by one of the great recitalists of the Victorian era, W.T. Best. Best was a national hero when he died in 1897. He was made organist to Liverpool Corporation in 1855 and on the Willis organ in St George's Hall gave 3 recitals a week for 40 years. Thomas Trotter is a present City of Birmingham organist. He gives a lunchtime recital every Wednesday and for many people they're unmissable. They're also, unbelievably, free.
There's been an organ in the town hall since 1834, and the first city organist was appointed in 1842. And since then, there have been 4 other organists, including myself. So the average reign of a city organist is about 30 years. I'm probably the youngest organist. I was appointed when I was 26. My predecessor, Sir George Tholden Bull, he was actually appointed in his 50s. And he stayed on to be organist here until he was well in his 80s. So generally people live to be very old when they play the organ in Birmingham.
I know, like me, you share a great fondness for organ transcriptions, and I'm glad to see that whole thing is coming back now into the organist repertoire. Now, what is it about transcriptions that attracts you?
I think they're very good to play to audiences who don't actually know that much about organ music, because they draw the listener into the sound of the organ if they know the music already. I always think that organ music is quite difficult to listen to if you don't know what's going on, whereas if you listen to an orchestral piece of music that you know played on the organ, it sort of helps you to adapt to the organ sound. Yeah. And it also shows off the technique and musicianship of the player, because they are extremely difficult, and they're very difficult to arrange on the organ. It's not just a question of playing the notes, you also have to do many changes of stops, whereas you have 60 people playing in an orchestra and you can have one instrument coming in one bar and another instrument taking over in another. It's all done by one person on the organ, so therefore that effect of changing all the time has to be done by the organist at the same time as playing the notes.
So this is the Waltz of the Flowers. See, it sounded so smooth and easy and just like you would hear the orchestral version. But If you play it again, could you, Thomas? And I'll try and describe what you're actually doing to make it sound so smooth and easy.
Okay.
Right, now then, he starts... Just see where you start. You've got your left hand on the swell keyboard, and that's going to give the accompaniment, and the feet on the pedals, and the right hand is going to play the tune on the grate. Here we go. Just playing on 2 keyboards, and his right hand's moved up to the solo organ just to play that bit on the reed. And then his left hand went down to the grate to play 1 chord on that, and before it went back to the swell, and now his feet are going absolutely mad, pushing the pedal down, the right hand pedal to make it louder, and he's putting a couple of buttons to make it louder. And now his left hand's on the swell, and his right hand's playing the tune on the grate, and now on the choir. Now he's gone back to the swell. Now his right hand's dashing back between 2 keyboards, and his left foot is still giving the rhythm of the whole piece, and he's coming to a brilliant finish. It's amazing. Thomas Trotter, who looks set to fill the organ bench at Birmingham for many years yet and keep alive a tradition of which the City Fathers of Birmingham can be justly proud. Trotter is the latest in a long line of great British soloists, amongst whom I include his predecessor at Birmingham, Sir George Thalburn Ball, even though he was born in Australia. And they all had such splendid-sounding names, didn't they? Thalburn Ball's predecessor, the great G.D. Cunningham, George Dorrington Cunningham, for instance, the legendary Edwin Lemaire, Reginald Goss Custard, W.G. Alcock, Ernest Bullock, John Dykes Bower, the last 3 of whom were knighted, and more recently the late E. Power Biggs. There were also lots of Herberts. Herbert Dawson, Herbert Brewer, Herbert Howells, who died in 1983 at the age of 91, by the way, and Herbert Sumsham, the former organist of Gloucester Cathedral, who is still with us at the age of 93. Was there ever such a long-lived profession? And it gives us a glimpse of musical history when we hear these great artists on record, playing sometimes instruments which no longer exist. Here is Sir Walter Galpin Alcock, who played the organ at the coronations of George VI, George V, and Edward VII. Organ of Alexandra Palace, destroyed by doodlebugs and damp in the last war, and to our eternal shame, never restored. We can hear Marcel Dupré on the organ of Queen's Hall, another superb instrument, bombed to bits in the last war. And here is Charles-Marie Widor himself, born as long ago as 1844, playing his famous toccata at the age of 88, recorded in April 1932 on the organ of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. We are listening to a musician who was a friend of Rossini, and Rossini was born exactly 200 years ago this month. Of any group of famous musicians, none are less known, less recognized in the street than the organist. They do their job hidden away out of public view, or at the very least, with their backs to us.
If you sit at the Riverside Church in New York or the Albert Hall here or the Festival Hall in London, the console does look like the flight deck of Concorde. And it is a physical instrument to play because you're really flying the spaceship, as it were. And so what I try to do, especially when I play for all the audiences for the 100 plus concerts a year around the world, I do everything I can to have the organ console dragged out where they can see. We've often said in the organ world that Heifetz would never fiddle from behind a potted palm. So why should an organist stay up in the dusty gallery unseen like his colleagues who play the flute or the piano or the symphony orchestra members or whatever who are completely visible?
Yes.
All of the mechanical and technical aspects of the organ means that there's a big barrier between the player and the actual sound that he produces. Whereas on a stringed instrument or a wind instrument, you're holding the instrument and you blow or you scrape on your bow and you produce the sound. With the organ, it's much more complicated and much more technical. And that's the whole problem with the organ. The technical aspects can get in the way of the music. So that's actually something I don't like about it. But once you can get over that hurdle, then I think it's an extremely satisfying, if very difficult, instrument to play.
The organ needs more missionary work in the field than any of the other instruments, simply because the organ has been a bit confined to the church for many years, and it has a wonderful role there. I'm certainly not saying that in any way, shape, or form, anything against it, but you know, the organ is as grand a concert instrument as any of the other instruments. It has as fantastic a repertoire, and it needs to be placed at the fore of the concert stage where we can be judged as musicians properly.
I often feel that if some of these dictators in the world had only been organists, you know, we wouldn't have had these wars. I mean, Saddam or something like that, you know, or Hitler or whatever it was. Only they'd been organists, they could have got rid of all their aggression just through playing the organ. I still respond very strongly indeed to the sound of a full, vast organ with a 32-foot, and in the case of the Sydney Town Hall, you know, 64-foot, all going away, and all the bombard divisions and everything all rattling around. It can be absolutely free. 5 manuals, you know, whatever else you need.
All about. Look, lummy, where have they all got to? I'll have to rouse them up a bit with the tune of the jolly old organ.
Seated One Day at the Organ was written and presented by Jeremy Nicholas, with contributions from Carlo Curley, Simon Preston, Jennifer Bate, Thomas Trotter and Horace Bate. The producer was Tim MacDonald.
BBC Radio 2.